Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to Analyze This, Mr. Bond, my channel where I look at the adventures of fictional super spy James Bond 007 and dig a little beneath the surface. I've just wrapped a long series on the Daniel Craig Bond films, and some of you suggested that I should apply the same approach to the Pierce Brosnan films, which is an interesting suggestion. I had admittedly not thought as deeply about the Brosnan films over the years as I had about the Daniel Craig films. The Daniel Craig films have their own unique energy and ethos. They're particularly clued into James Bond's psychology, and that was one reason I was prompted to do that series. But revisiting the Brosnan films in preparation for this series, which is going to start here with this video on GoldenEye, it becomes clear how Brosnan's Bond has a very particular ethos of his own. And I think we can define a unifying principle for what encapsulates Brosnan's Bond, how he behaves, and how this character was redefined in this transitional moment for the franchise. GoldenEye came after License to Kill. There had been a lull, and it, in many ways, reestablished Bond the icon after an absence from the cinemas for a number of years. And it was tasked in a way that no prior Bond was tasked with reestablishing the character and reestablishing the iconography of the character. In many ways, the perception of Brosnan Bond is that he's the first synthesized Bond. He's the greatest hits Bond. He's the collection of what came before. And I think a lot of that has to do with the baggage that GoldenEye carries. GoldenEye is the film that is reestablishing Bond the icon for the 1990s, the world after the Cold War, and it makes itself acutely aware of that mission. And in doing so, there's a slightly retrospective aspect to it, but I don't actually think that Brosnan's Bond is truly synthesizing the Bonds that came before. Brosnan's Bond is a unique creation. He is the first Bond who has a strong sense of both personal history and geopolitical history, and you see those overlapping. He is the Bond that leaps forward from the Cold War into the then present of the 1990s. And you see this in GoldenEye. It is the first Bond movie to really, bridge two time zones. It starts in the Cold War and leaps ahead 9 years. And GoldenEye is preoccupied with this idea that Bond is a man out of time, and it's not a personal statement for Bond the way it is in Skyfall, where it's Bond, you're out of step with the young kids of today and technologies and all these things. It is more about Bond being a product of a particular geopolitical climate and the geopolitical climate having shifted. And I think as we look over each of these movies, we see reflections not just of Bond's own history, allies from the past, girlfriends from the past, but also the sort of in the ruins of the prior geopolitical order, there are new opportunities for malicious actors, Bond villains, to spring up and enact sinister deeds. And that is really the thrust of the Brosnan Bond era. Is this Bond is a character with a historical legacy, and he is in some ways a man out of time a little bit, and carries that sense of him, of a vehicle of a past era, which is very interesting. That's very unique for Pierce Brosnan's Bond. In some ways, Pierce Brosnan's Bond is carrying over a bit in terms of emotional texture from the Timothy Dalton Bonds, and I want to say that Timothy Dalton's Bond, being the most human of the original classic Bond run, was the first who felt like a true working professional as 007. He was the one that you could believe having a real friendship with Felix Leiter, as comes into License to Kill, and had a level of emotional vulnerability, though Dalton also has a reputation for being one of the toughest Bonds. Pierce Brosnan carries forward a level of that emotional vulnerability, but he is not as hardened as the other Bonds of this series. He is emotionally accessible in a way that none of the other Bonds are, and he is in touch with his emotions and is able to understand his own emotions in a way that you don't see being the case for the other Bonds, Daniel Craig included, who has a lot of emotions but doesn't always seem to be aware of what's going on. And GoldenEye establishes this pretty quickly. This is a story about Bond, obviously, confronting his one-time friend who is now turned evil. But when he believes that friend is killed in the opening sequence, we get this very dramatic, brief view of Bond's face, and the emotional distress on his face both speaks to the depth of his emotions for Alec Trevelyan, who he now believes to be dead, but also gives us a level of emotional accessibility that is pretty raw. It's not just anger. It's like grief and shock, real, human emotions. And in general, Brosnan's emotions tend to live on the surface for both in terms of him being attuned to the anxiety of a moment. You can see him, the gears turning in his head as he's processing given, possible threats in the area, the sort of like tension that's there as he's feeling that. But you also feel his excitement and kind of joy when he's able to pull off feats of great strength and awe, his boyish excitement at moments of great excitement for him. Tomorrow Never Dies has the great moment too, where he just like laughs, when he's able to reinflate the tires in the car in Tomorrow Never Dies. That's kind of like that's the spectrum that I think of with Brosnan Bond. He's very emotionally accessible, which also makes him romantically one of the most tender Bonds. And that's pretty interesting, especially when you put it alongside this slightly performative aspect to his Bond. His Bond is a Bond that is very aware of his own poise. Brosnan's Bond has a very clear and elegant body language. Daniel Craig's Bond is also preoccupied with body language as a way to express character, but you see it in Pierce Brosnan's Bond. There's this sort of very almost fluid sense of movement for the character. And the character's sort of quips and rejoinders are a little different than they felt with Sean Connery or Roger Moore, which were very clearly often ways of asserting like personal superiority. Like for Connery and Roger Moore, they suggest a sort of aloofness, but also, especially in Roger Moore's case, a level of like being the cleverest man in the room. Whereas Brosnan's Bond, more than any other, seems to be using humor as a sort of like deflection technique. And the movie's dialogue. This is the first movie to really like psychoanalyze Bond at great length. The M scene in this movie. Dressing down Bond and his tendencies. We have a lot of that sort of conversation going on in this movie throughout. But you get this sense of like comedy being a real escape hatch for this Bond in terms of dealing with stress relief. In many ways, you see that the sort of like him processing stress and letting it go in a way that is very like detectable in a way that it isn't for other Bonds. He's also introduced as being the most, I don't want to say most, there's an aristocratic element, a sort of familiarity with luxury that is very unique to Brosnan's Bond. He's introduced after that pre-title sequence in Monaco, where he seems every bit at home, wearing a day cravat and driving an iconic and significant, but still very luxurious vintage sports car with a bottle of champagne in the armrest. Right? There is this sense that he is very much the movie star Bond, In many ways, Pierce Brosnan is fulfilling the dream of the idea that Cary Grant might have played Bond, who was never seriously considered for the role, but it did come up in conversation, according to Albert R. Broccoli, between him and Cary Grant, that like potentially would he be interested in playing the character. And you get the sense that this is the fulfillment of that. There's something very classic Hollywood about the glamour of Brosnan's Bond, mixed with a sort of like 1990s luxury attire, often stereotyped as like he's the businessman Bond. He does seem like he's very comfortable in the corridors of wealth in a way that is not always true of prior Bonds. In particular, Daniel Craig's Bond is a distinct juxtaposition to that. We're told wears his suits with disdain. There's a sense of Pierce Brosnan's Bond really feeling like he came through that sort of like comfort with that level of ivory tower positioning. And the playboy aspect of that really comes off in the introduction. And maybe that's some of the carryover from his Remington Steele days, like informing the character, much as Roger Moore's Bond has some of the flamboyance of his own personal tastes, and the character, the saint, a little bit, kind of showing up and adding a new layer of texture to the character when Roger Moore took over from Sean Connery. But you definitely feel that he is like a wealthy playboy type in these movies. And that sort of boyish charm is in many ways what I think of as being very unique about Brosnan's Bond. It goes in hand with that emotional vulnerability that we get throughout these movies, especially in romantic settings, that there's just sort of a boyish glee. This is a Bond who very much enjoys himself. And, Connery would seem to be having a good time. So did Roger Moore. But there is just a sheer delight that comes through in moments in Brosnan's Bond that is very unique to him. This is also the first Bond to, I shouldn't say the first. With License to Kill, it introduced a framing for Bond of like the "this time it's personal" narrative. And even during the Brosnan era, when, Die Another Day came out, people were starting to say, okay, I'm getting tired of the "this time it's personal" sort of storytelling. This was before Bond would go rogue every movie, right? But it's like, it shows how long this has been in the works and how long this personal element to the Bond films has been in play, really, since 1989's License to Kill. So Brosnan's Bond is introduced, as we've said, as kind of like this product of this prior era, a man who is struggling with the transition of the Guard, struggling to find his place in it. And the conclusion the movie makes is that this is it's really about him learning to confront his enemy on his own terms. Like, why are you doing this? Well, it's for me. It's not for England this time. And that's because his ally has turned against him, turned against the world. And Alec Trevelyan is an interesting character insofar as he is the first villain to truly mirror 007 in that sort of like personal psychoanalysis sort of way. Obviously, Scaramanga and Roger Moore's Bond had a bit of that mirroring element, but it's played very differently in that movie than this sort of like two brotherly friends who are now locked into like a sort of intimate rivalry. And we don't get a strong sense of what 006 and Bond's relationship was like, but it's telling that Bond's reaction to Trevelyan's death, and as well as the way that they kind of interact, especially in like the train confrontation, where Trevelyan has this very sort of creepy, preoccupation with like getting one over on Bond by trying to show that, like establish that he got to push himself on Natalia before Bond had a chance. Like this sort of like rivalry that suggests a level of like intimacy in the past that is interesting. And it's interesting because Brosnan's Bond in general feels like he's the one Bond who has this sort of universe of fairly established relationships. It's interesting when we see him interacting in the office with Bill Tanner. It feels like a very lived-in relationship with someone in the office. And that kind of carries through in his relationship with Zukovsky. Again, this is a character with a lot of history, but it's also the first version of Bond where we really get the sense that, yeah, this is a guy who probably has friends at the workplace. You got that a little bit with Dalton's Bond, but these movies really lean into it. The only aside to that is really his relationship with Moneypenny, which is very odd in the Brosnan movies. It's sort of prickly and the rejoinders are, especially in GoldenEye, are almost like hostile. It's a very chilly encounter between Bond and Moneypenny in this movie, as she is representing the shift in attitudes about men and women in the workplace. She's given some very pointed rejoinders there, but there's also this weird undercurrent of desperation for her Moneypenny and her Moneypenny's attraction to Bond, that especially comes out in like Once We Get to Die Another Day, which we'll talk about later. That gives their dynamic a really peculiar energy, especially in terms of the rest of the series, that I to be honest, I've never really quite thought clicked. But it does. But even in that instance, Bond and Moneypenny in the Brosnan era clearly have a level of like weird intimacy in their relationship together. It's not just like light repartee. There's almost like an emotional charge to their interactions that's very intriguing. And so with 006, this sort of mirrored version of Bond, the dark Bond, who has betrayed, his prior friend, but is also acting on the sins of the past. Again, the sins of the past motif is something that comes up in the Brosnan movies quite a bit. Is starting to frame Bond as the Bond who is able to rise above history, right? So Brosnan's Bond is able to kind of go with the changing of the times and find his place in the new era, where Alec Trevelyan is focused on righting the wrongs of the past and can't really move past it. And that, in some ways, is part of the thematic mirroring between the two of them. Finally, let's just talk briefly here as I wrap up this video about the moment on the beach between Bond and Natalia, which again encapsulates just the emotional accessibility of Brosnan's Bond, and was up to that point the most vulnerable Bond had ever been in the series, and transparent about his own emotional state. It's, that's what keeps me alive. No, that's what keeps you alone. This sort of awareness of the trade-offs he's making and his own bitterness over some of the choices he has to make in this life that he's selected. It carries over a little bit from the sort of awareness of Dalton's Bond, but is much more personal, is much more emotionally tangible, is a much more again, keeping with this movie, like psychoanalytic a little bit, that really is setting up the stage for where the Daniel Craig Bond movies will go in a very big way. But the difference here is that Daniel Craig's Bond is wrapped in emotional confusion, whereas Brosnan's Bond seems pretty always seems to have a fairly clear grasp of his own emotions and what he's choosing to do and why he's choosing to do it. He's just able to express it and is willing to express it in a way that we haven't seen with prior Bonds. And that moment on the beach is really where you see the seed planted for how the character will behave for the next few years. And I think presumably for the rest of time. I don't think you see a version of the character that doesn't have some level of self-awareness about himself in the way that Connery and Roger Moore's Bond very much lived in the present, acted in the present. We're not necessarily like emotionally dead. Roger Moore's Bond was certainly capable of expressing anger and regret and things like that, but there isn't this sense of distance from themselves in the moment, whereas Brosnan's Bond, you see the wheels turning as he is in the midst of these situations. There's a sense of a sort of inner monologue unfolding for Brosnan's Bond that in many ways up until this point in the series hadn't really existed. Even with Dalton's Bond and his own connection to his own emotions, there's a sense of like relentlessness there. There's a sense of purpose. He's going to go, achieve and do what he has to do, and he knows what he has to do. There's not as much of this self-reflective quality, whereas Brosnan's Bond is the first one to introduce this really strong self-reflective aspect to the character. And that fits with a character who, again, has to be somewhat self-reflective, because this is a character that has crossed over eras in time. And with that, I think that encapsulates where the character's at in GoldenEye and lays a good foundation for how we can start to explore how Brosnan's Bond behaves in subsequent adventures, which I think you'll find there's some interesting aspects to that as we start to go through the remainder of the Brosnan films. So let me know what you thought about this video. Let me know what you think about Brosnan's Bond, this tender, boyish, charming, playboy, movie star Bond. How do you feel about it in retrospect? The Brosnan era has been going through a bit of a renaissance lately, especially in wake of No Time to Die. Bond fans, I think, have been looking back on the Brosnan Bond era a little bit more fondly. So let me know how you feel about Brosnan's Bond. Let me know how you feel about some of the ideas I presented here. And I will catch you in the next one, where we'll talk about Tomorrow Never Dies.